realize how you got your start in Lowell. So it's just a fascinating story. Start us with that.
Yeah, actually, I came to Lowell on my way to college because I had relatives who had come up. Most of my family was from New York. And one part of the family, my mom lived across from neighbors who really, they were like second family. And a couple of the members of the family actually came to Lowell, bought a portion of a textile enterprise.
Oh, wow.
And they lived on Gibson Street for many, many years. Unfortunately, economically, they didn't do very well, like a lot of things in Lowell at the time. But I do remember that the Thropes, and Bessie Thrope was a pretty remarkable person. And when I didn't know anything about Lowell, when I actually started out here, I would go over to dinner once in a while at her house, and she would tell me about the family. So I actually was the second choice for WCAP in the news department. I had graduated from Emerson. I was looking for a job. And they hired somebody. I applied for a job, but they hired somebody else first. And about 2 weeks later, from the owner of the station, got a phone call and they said, this person didn't work out very well. Are you still open to taking a job? And I said yes. So I came to Lowell. Again, I was like a...
Just to back up, not everyone would know what WCAP,
Okay.
we know it's
Sure.
a radio station, but its importance to the city
Sure.
of Lowell.
So WCAP is a small, local, 500-watt radio station that, as you say, was very important to the city of Lowell. People would listen to the newscasts, particularly, in the morning, and in a lot of ways it dictated politics. And some of the more interesting politicians, actually, Jackie may remember this, on the weekends would buy like 10 minutes of time, and then they would just scream at the microphone on all these. You'd think we have conspiracy theories now. We had them then as well. So politics in Lowell were wild and woolly. And again, coming from like New York, and I was always interested in politics, but it was more, who's running for the Senate and who's in the House and who's the congressperson. And this was really, the absolute localist politics you could get. So I really received a schooling, and I think I mentioned this to Jackie, the first school committee meeting that I covered, because I was too green to cover the city council, that was much more sophisticated. I went to the meeting, and Clement McDonough, who was an older school committee person at the time, at like 9:59, stood up and he said, I don't believe any public business should be done as of 10 o'clock. And he walked out of and apparently that was his thing. He just walked out of the meeting. And a couple of the school committee people introduced me later, and the meeting got over at 10:30 or whatever, and they said, come with us. They all went to the Old Worthen, which is a bar a block from City Hall. Clement McDonough had already gotten a head start. And we were drinking like 50-cent beers, and that's how I got my start in Lowell politics.
I think those beers might still be.
Might be.
It's very popular.
So anyway, worked at WCAP for a couple years. I was always interested in local politics. And one of the stories I covered actually was an educator by the name of Patrick Mogan, who was the assistant superintendent of schools at the time, convened a meeting at the old Smith Baker Center with a professor from the University of Pittsburgh who talked about an urban cultural park, which I had never heard about. But the whole idea and the understanding, and I remember what he said at the time, because we were across, he said, here's Giava's Market, Greek market. There was a small Greek restaurant next to it. I think it was a Portuguese. So he said the richness of the culture here in an area where we're across the street from all these things. And in Lowell, I only knew there were canals and mills. That's all I ever heard about. So the story, as Pat would say, the human stories about the whole history of the city and immigration, just sort of, wow, this is incredible. And so from then on, I reported a lot on the park. And when I eventually got, a chance to meet Paul Tsongas, as I explained, I said to him, because I was a, very, know-it-all 24-year-old at the time, I said, well, you have no chance to win because the congressional district had been Republican for like the last 50 or 60 years. But if you do, I want to go to Lowell and work on this national park thing. And he was clearly taken aback by my attitude. But to his credit, he decided to hire me and give me a chance.
So your original interest then was coming in to work on the idea of that park project.
Right.
So say maybe a little bit more about the challenges of that, what the city was like, how that got implemented, and any stories you remember connected to that.
I think if you asked the person on the street about Lowell, they would say, they would tell you a story about, perhaps how, their parents or grandparents worked in the mills, and what they would say to their children is, you can do anything you want, but you're never going to the mills, because it was just a scarring factor, which people don't realize today. And having been in, say, the Wanalancet Mill, which was the last mill to be operating before it went out of business, the humidity, the noise, the hours, it was hard to imagine how anyone could work in those conditions, but people did, and they worked 12 hours a day and 6 and 7 days a week. We were fortunate to meet some of the old mill workers who were still there, or through the families. So again, it was part of a story that needed to be preserved. The other thing is that the way they calculated the unemployment rate at that time, which is a little bit different than today, the story we would have once a month when the statistics came out was on the radio, or as a headline in Lowell Sun, because Lowell Sun, the radio station was important, but the Lowell Sun was the dominant media source in Lowell. Everybody read the paper, and politics gravitated around that morning. And it was family owned, and let's just say it wasn't the Washington Post. So it's a hyper political city. So the unemployment rate at that point was 13 and 14%. And there was a dour, in many ways pessimistic city, because even the peak didn't really treat people very well. Maybe if you were a mill girl, you were treated better, but that era was long gone.
Right.
The mill owners played the immigrant populations against each other. And so, in comes Pat Mogan as assistant superintendent of schools and says, there's value here. There's value in the history, there's value in the culture. And there was a pretty remarkable group of people that I started to run into at that time, which was Human Services Corporation, which had people like Karen Carpenter, who's still involved through the Parker Foundation, Kay Georgelos, Peter Stamos, and for the most part, they were educators. And they pushed back against the model cities model in the country, which in the 1970s, late 60s and 70s was, let's take everything down.
Right.
And that was the other ethic in Lowell. There are a lot of people, particularly in the business community, that just wanted to take everything down. And they said, well, gee, Lawrence did a lot of that. They have a lot of new things. Everything old was bad. So that was an ethic you really had to turn around.
Great. Were you here when, for example, they put in some of those first urban renewal projects or demolitions? I'm thinking right on the edge of downtown with Back Central, where the Choice Fitness is today.
Yeah.
And that might have been done before you came.
So I remember when I was at WCAP at Central Street, where Central Savings Bank was, which is now Eastern Bank, and the bell was put up in that little plaza.
Right.
So the reason that plaza was shaped that way is there was a triangular shaped building, which was very beautiful and remarkable. And I remember walking by, and again, without really knowing what was going on, and there were the classic bunch of people, older people, looking through the fence, watching the building come down.
Yeah.
So again, it wasn't modern enough, and it was a beautiful building, and it was highly visible because of the shape of the building.
Right.
It was taken down for sort of cement and new granite structure because it was modern.
Right, right.
And that was repeated a lot. I sort of joke with Steve Stoll, who's the historic board administrator, and just say,
Yeah.
you've got an easy job now because everybody has bought in
Right.
to the ethic. But, we'll tell you one story, jumping ahead a little bit. Getting into Paul Tsongas's involvement promoting downtown Lowell.
Right.
And again, he's not somebody who sat around, Washington. He came back to the district as much as possible, and he lobbied for all these values. And he and Pat Mogan, Pat on the cultural, philosophical rationale, and Paul on the many times at the strong-arming side, but also always doing enough homework in Washington. And it was a little bit different then. It wasn't as partisan. So we had Republicans and Democrats watching what was going on in Lowell, and we parlayed that with a number of other communities that were into urban parks. But there was a Bay Bank building, which is still there, again on Central Street, and in the scheme of the 60s, it had been covered up with this sort of iron grill work, these waves of iron grill work, which was ornamental and supposed to be attractive. They had taken out all of the original windows and put in these big square plate windows and so forth. And so for years he had been trying to get them to take this down because the skin of the building was actually quite beautiful, and is today. So giving away the punchline. So he talked to the board members, and they said, well, we'll hire an architect, and we'll do this, and we'll do that. And he just said to them, I'm just going to tell you by some given date, it was probably like a month later, I'm going to be standing outside of your building telling people how you haven't cooperated, how ugly it is, and what a beautiful building you're covering up. Well, magically, they redid the building.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful, and it's there today.
Right.
So that's sort of the difference between, that early ethic where everything old was bad,
Right.
and then having a value, because you can't reproduce. Peter Arcel will tell you, because he's done a lot of these statistics. Peter was my successor at the Lowell Historic Preservation Commission,
Right.
still is working for the Lowell National Park, and they surveyed 6 million square feet at one point of vacant mill space.
Wow.
And the fact that almost every single one of those square feet wasn't taken down, was preserved, and is now places where people live, work, go to school,
Right.
dormitories. That's a richness and a history that you cannot recreate.
Can you tell us something more about the founding of that commission, the historic commission?
Yeah, let's talk about the park legislation first.
Oh, you
just
want to do
to-
that?
I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Good,
And
okay.
you went to work for
So I did go to Congressman Tsongas.
Local people talk you into
Right.
that, or kind of maybe you could connect, take that to the line.
Yeah, Paul was sort of befriended and supported by a group of local women who were very involved in politics, almost like a League of Women Voters kind of thing. And I mean, to be progressive in Lowell at that time was like, you weren't going in the club and you're stepping out from the cigar smoke. And,
Right.
but, Paul had an interesting history because, he's quite intelligent. He was a clear thinker. He had gone to Dartmouth and Yale, but he wasn't satisfied just with the academics. He went into the Peace Corps. He was inspired by Robert Kennedy. And so that's a good indication of what his mentality was. He was from a very strict Greek family, but the family believed in community. So Paul was always thinking ahead. And when he came back from the Peace Corps, he decided he wanted to be involved in local politics. He ran for the city council, and he came in 8th. But he won, and once you get on the city council, and the first thing he and several other allies did was to lobby to replace the city manager with someone more progressive, and they succeeded. And so he went from city council to reform-minded county commissioner to Congress, and again, mentioning that this had been a Republican district for many, many years. He also was fortunate, and we all have to be fortunate in timing, because he was elected in the Watergate year.
Right.
And so the Republicans sort of took it on the chin that year. But that being said, it was a sort of ragamuffin, group of us campaigners, and he spent $90,000 in that campaign. I think when Nikki Tsongas ran the last time or next to last time, her budget was $2+ million. But it took like the women that we're describing and a lot of volunteers and fortitude. And it wasn't like, even with Watergate, it wasn't like he was going to win right away. At one time we were sitting at his house, and he had, we were very depressed because nothing we could do could get any publicity, anything in the paper. We had no money to do advertising at the time. And he said, do we all agree that I'm not going to win, right? And we said, yeah, we all agree. And he said, I was thinking when I was shaving this morning that as, to clean up politics for campaign financing, I'm going to walk to Washington. What do you all think of that? And everybody totally rolled their eyes and said, maybe we could still win. Maybe there's a way to win. But it tells you again that so many of these things, like the park, like the things that Pat Mogan was talking about, was so much against the tide that you had to have a certain sense of optimism and idealism to make these things hopefully happen.
Well, and strength of character too. You have to have the optimism to really, seems to really keep working to push it through.
Yeah. So he did win, and when we got to Congress, a priority was the national park legislation. So in addition to some other issues areas, that's what I worked on every day.
Okay.
And I mean, to have a staff person that was working on one piece of legislation in your congressional office with like 5 or 6 staffers, that's pretty unique. So every day he was doing things on the Interior Committee, and that's why he had gotten on the Interior Committee, to make friends and to talk about this idea of an urban park, which again was not very popular because the traditional Park Service people thought all the cities would come in and have urban parks, and then Yellowstone would never get funding again. And it's really all about economic redevelopment of the city of Lowell, which had a smidgen of truth. But our case was parks should not just be for presidents. They should be for people who worked, immigrated, were part of the labor story. And again, that wouldn't have worked if that really wasn't true and if there truly wasn't, a remarkable story. And that's what really inspired all of us, because we believed in that story.
Right, and that it is what Lowell was. For the first iteration in the 19th century.
Yep.
What were said, you mentioned, having to, you mentioned the passion, the dedication. I think about the stories of Pat Mogan and people kind of almost behind his back saying,
yeah, that's so true.
Never happened. But he never gave up. He convinced City Councilor Paul Tsongas, then Congressman Tsongas, yourself, that idealism.
Paul,
so many obstacles to overcome. And that's how you overcame those. Because you were part of the legislation. There were some big roadblocks. That, as you mentioned, the council nationally, there was the worry that money would go. What about locally? Did anybody locally kind of poo-poo that idea that Lowell should have a national park there?
Oh, totally. Yeah, totally. It's funny because in Lowell it's sort of sold as economic development, but we, somewhere between Delaware and Maryland, the story changed, right? So in looking at your questions, I wrote down some of the names of people who I think really were responsible and who were the visionary people. I remember saying to Pat, Pat, like, I've been at this for a year or two, and like, people are wearing me down. Like, how did you do this for so long? And one is he didn't have to tell me that he believed in it. And he believed in turning negatives into positives, and that's really what happened at Lowell. But at one point he said to me, I just keep talking and talking until people go along with me because they don't want to hear me talking anymore. And it really was true because, my old secretary who lived in the acre all her life would say, that person could talk a dog off a meat truck. And Pat really could do that. But there was, a truth and a credibility to what he was saying.
Right.
And, one of the later questions you asked me about, say, the role of education in the university. That's, Pat believed in the educative city. He believed in that not just for Lowell, but he believed in that for the future of the population in Lowell and the rest of, of the country. And that's why he brought in the people he did to see what was here. He was very invested in getting people nationally to recognize the resources in Lowell. So he was talking to a lot of people, not just local people,
Right.
but to rally. And a lot of times it was much easier for people coming into Lowell to see the value
Right.
than the people who had that stereotypical view of this, unfortunate, forlorn, city, and how did we end up here? And again, there were a lot of people in Lowell, and you still hear it once in a while today. They had never gone outside of Lowell. People hadn't even gone into Boston.
Right.
Part of it was the economic conditions, but just that was their world.
Right.
So getting people to open their minds that way, was tough. And again, I think a lot of it, he did it because of ethnic pride, because that ethnic pride and the culture was carried forward, even if there was a negative view of the city as a whole. But the people I remember in terms of, the cheerleaders at the time, and this was when, actually the state established the Heritage Park, which was a big selling point, because we could go to Washington and say, the state has already done their part and provided X million dollars and is doing a visitor center. And that was Mike Dukakis working with Paul, but Mike Dukakis, originally family from Lowell, understanding that value. Armin LeMay, who was close to Mike Dukakis and later worked in his administration. Armin is just the most enthusiastic, cheerleader ever. He was on the Preservation Commission. Paul Marion, who has, a legacy for the community at the university as a poet and somebody who was really a disciple of Pat. Frank Keefe, who was a planner, who went on to be the head of administration and finance in Boston. So there was really a core of planners, thinkers, people who encouraged this to happen. And, eventually were able to make the case to where there were doubters, but the doubters eventually stepped back because the positives were so strong. Even when one of the strategies of the national park legislation was to get the city itself to establish the historic board. It would have been easy to write into the legislation, a requirement that you had to do this, and preserve these buildings. But, as we looked at that, we took the harder road, which was we have to get the city to buy in. So we actually had to go to the state legislature and get local legislation, home rule legislation, to get the historic board established. And we had several of the state representatives who did it very obligingly and were not happy and eventually it wasn't really that we convinced them, but that there was more of a consensus to do that, and it became sort of a linchpin of this promised $40 million that was going to be delivered by the federal government for the national park. That was the authorizing dollars in the legislation.
It's amazing. It's amazing to think how hurricane and you did overcome. I love the way that you talked about creating this community of like-minded people. And I know all those people and everything. I think you attracted a lot of talent too, would you say?
Yeah, that's a great segue into the Preservation Commission. Again, we were pretty, I don't even know what the word is, but we never settled for, the director of the National Park Service came to Paul Tsongas's office and said, I got a compromise for you. And there was no certainty whatsoever this legislation was going to get passed. It was so novel.
Right.
And there were so many traditional people against it. So Bill Whalen came to Paul's office, we sat in, and he said, yeah, I've got basically a deal for you, okay? We will designate, you tell us how many buildings to designate. We will designate 5 or 6 buildings. In this case, it was between Market Street and the boot mills. we will designate 5 buildings. We will buy those buildings, and that will be the national park. And we talked about it not very long, and Paul said, that's not the idea. Like the cliche today, the city is the park. The city is the park. And we need not only to have interpretation throughout, we need to have the participation of people, and we need to have a preservation district. Because in addition to the park, there's a preservation district that circles the city and allows dialogue on how these different assets are treated. And so Bill Whalen said, I respect what you're doing, but that's something I can't support. And so they didn't. The Park Service recommended against the park when the final legislation came out. Yeah, and that's a whole nother story about how it got passed. But.
Right. But again, just I think for people now to remember that it was never a given.
No.
That it was always a fight and always a test of character in order to get the park through, because now we see it and it's so much part of Lowell's identity. That's one of the reasons we're doing these interviews, to say, well, how do you make something like that come about?
Right. There's 2 other groups of people that I should really mention too. One, that we had some outstanding superintendents of the national park who got this from the beginning and advocated for us, or we wouldn't be so far along this path. And they were pretty remarkable people. And the other thing is the congressional delegation. I mean, it started with Paul, but the Jim Shannons and the Nikki Songus and the Marty Meehan's and now Lori Trahan, again, phenomenal advocates, and they got it right away.
Right.
And they're really responsible for keeping the money flowing, or the park really wouldn't succeed.
Right.
I mean, the National Park Service has a lot of limitations about what they can do in terms of marketing and advocacy. So a lot of the superintendents just sort of push the envelope. And the other thing I'd say, which came up in Jackie's questions, is that the institutions in Lowell, we had a lot of calls from different congressional districts, like, well, we have this locomotive park, we have this, we have that, how can you do this? And I remember the regional director of the National Park Service who participated on the Lowell Historic Preservation Commission saying, you're very fortunate here. You're 30 miles from Boston, you've got, an updated highway system, and you've got a business and an educational community that you can point to with pride that interacts with all these things. So that's a pretty sort of magical combination of things. So I give the university, I give the community college, and where did this whole thing come from? It came from Pat Mogan, an educator. So we can't forget that. And I think when I think any of us look at all these experiences, we look back to education and say, as disadvantaged as Lowell was at some point, as many challenges as people have, including new immigrants to Lowell, the antidote here and the answer is education. Right. And the park is very much about education too. Yeah.
Great point.
And the perfect segue, we want to make sure we talk a little bit about your transition. I mean, the key to Lowell has always been this public-private partnership. And you yourself transitioned into private development. Sometimes when I look at folks like you and see Jacqueline who was there before you and the real estate work that you do, you really create the playbook for others to think about how to do meaningful, important public-private partnerships that do well both for the business developer and the community. So talk about your transition into that private world, and then I want to talk a little bit, we want to talk about how you did that. So start with that transition.
I mean, it's all sort of the same in a way, that once you have a stake in the community, and once you're in a position, where you can help. So I did a lot of political consulting, and we go around the country and advise different Democratic candidates. And the one thing I said to the candidates here is, and I didn't say it to them, but they knew it, I don't want any money. I don't want to take a dollar. That puts you in a different position. I just want to help the people that I like. So when we ran the first Cambodian American for city council, and Jim Cooney, who Jim said, I'm giving you $50, but you've really lost it. If you think that a Cambodian American can win for city council. You're just so far off the deep end. But it was the right thing to do. And I didn't even, my ex, I want to talk about her for a moment, said, you need to, I don't want to meet Riddy. I don't want to help any other political candidates. I've helped too many people. Like, I want to go on with my life. No, just come in and talk to him. And, we talked for 3 hours, and then I helped him. And then, so you help, and again, I'm not unique that way. You help people that can make a better community. You help younger people to navigate. And, somebody who actually works for the university now in the planning department said to me at one point over a beer, he said, you can't sort of believe how hard it is to break into Lowell because of all the people who know each other for a zillion years. Like, we're really intimidated by all you people, but we're trying to, help also. And I remembered that. That was probably 10 years ago in terms of trying to make people feel comfortable. Dorcas Grigg-Saito from the Community Health Center was a great mentor also. People would come up to us and say, gee, we'd really like to get a Cambodian. We'd really like to get, an African American on the board. And what she did at the health center was she mentored people. She brought them on boards. I know Jackie has had this experience. She helped them be equipped to be comfortable in, a board atmosphere where you could easily be intimidated by others. So, that occurs to me. So I like the opportunity to help younger people. And in terms of, the private versus the public development, it's accurate. I mean, they don't really change that much because the projects we're attracted to or we're asked to participate on, for the most part, have those public-private elements. Some developers that I know have been quite successful, they'll develop in Lowell or Kansas. And my new partner, Gary Siddell, feels the same way. The breadth of our world is sort of from Lowell to Haverhill. And we like to do that by being familiar and being able to walk into a town hall, to have a chat, to try and be genuine, to listen to them, and to do things that are helpful to a city, a town, or community. So we don't really even think about it. That's just the way we like to operate. And part of giving back to the community, this is where I want to mention Lynn. And Lynn and I have this crazy relationship where we're divorced, but we're closest of friends. And you have to with 11 grandchildren. So Lynn comes from Freeport, Illinois. She gets her master's degree at UMass Boston, and then ultimately her additional degree at UMass Lowell, through a program that she could have never afforded if she had to pay for the program at the time. We have 3 kids, adopt 2 more kids, Cambodian and Laotian, that live in Lowell. I mean, it's a Lowell story. And she works for the health center for, 30-something years, to the point where she's got a women's services a wing, dedicated to her name. Where else can you do that? I mean, where else can you have that sort of impact? So that sort of says a lot about Lowell.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a very powerful story. And, to add to that, as myself, it's Pittsburgh. I was on Paul's Executive campaign as a college student, and I remember Fred Faust, who was pretty much head of council both. I mean, I was a kid, right? Looking at your team that you had a it's all very dedicated public service, and you and Landon, what you've done for this community is really nothing short of amazing. I know Jacqueline here, I was tracking him today, one of the other nonprofits you've been involved in is the Community Foundation, and you're involved in this waterways project that is still really important. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I sort of, my dad was very organized and my mother was very artistic, Definitely take after my mother. I'm not that organized, but she was very creative. She was in her 60s. She got a degree in landscaping. She went back to school. She played the piano. She did drawings. She related really well to younger people. And so I think one of the most fun things in life is to be creative. So whether it's creating, campaign ideas or advertisements or marketing or just, again, helping people articulate, and tackle the tasks they're trying to, to tackle by, volunteering your time. That's the thing that's always stimulated me. So, in waterways, maybe I'm sort of, I don't want to say I'm the Pat Mogan because I don't want to take that kind of credit, but, when we have our waterways meeting, we meet once a week. It's like, all right, Jay Lantis, okay, what's your crazy idea this week? And we've had everything from, we're going to rent like the rickshaws that go to Fenway Park for the first bridge opening. So every time we have an event, Jay says, how are the rickshaws? How are the rickshaws coming? So, if you come along with 10 enough stimulating, crazy ideas, maybe one will work, but you got to always be open to the next one.
Right.
So kind of keeping your eyes on it, still working on the future of the city as a revitalization.
Yeah, and in ways, like, again, I grew up in a suburb of New York, which never really did much for me. I'm sure there are great people in New Rochelle, New York, but, coming here and even going back to that first vision when I drove in to see my relatives, and I remember, how you have those very sort of old, sort of fuzzy memories. And my memory was coming into Lowell, and I think I was on the Lord Overpass at the time. So I would be looking at like the Western Avenue and a bunch of the Jackson Street mills. And I'd just never seen anything like that. Yeah. So that was sort of my first impression. So, the opportunity to work in a place like this, and again, as you both know, I mean, there are just so many wonderful people here. They're wonderful friends, wonderful people to work with, and that stimulates you too. So there are times you're butting your head against things, but there's always great people, and there's people that deserve the kind of effort that we all put in.
So to wrap up, I don't think you're Marie, and I think you've said a lot to the next generation already. Right. So many comments to kind of go through there. But in particular, if you had any advice or thought, why is it important to make a difference? Why is it important to give back?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question today because of the partisanship. And I can understand why, the world is so complicated. Look at what's going on in the Middle East right now, that people would want to, people would just want to retreat. And I think there's a lot of kids that do that, and I understand the rationale for that. But I would say, as an example in Lowell, that people really individually can make, a huge difference. And it's more rewarding to do that for me. Now I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, to sit in front of a video game for 4 hours. Those are the things I lament when I see my grandkids. So I drag them into the downtown, and I drag them to the exhibits, and I drag them to the museums. And I think they appreciate that. And I remember my parents doing, a lot of the same things to open me up culturally to ideas. So I would say, while it's hard to be optimistic because you can make a lot of things happen. You can help a lot of people, and especially in a scale like Lowell, because I've worked in the federal, the state, and the local government. You can really walk into City Hall and make a difference. People will work with you. People will listen to you. 20 people come to a city council meeting. People are going to, perk up their interest and listen, because most people want to do, good and positive things. So, I would say, be optimistic and shoot for the moon. Okay, so I just want to say that we didn't get into the sort of collaboration of the business community, but what I want to say is, again, a lesson from Paul Tsongas is that the business community, the political community, and all communities are not exclusive. Paul called on, the best spirits and hearts of the business community to participate and do good things for the populace as a whole, and there were the benefits of doing it. He didn't try and tell us how terrible the business community was and how they were exploiting all the resources and this and that. He said basically, let's work together. And I remember in the presidential campaign, the story he would tell, or the little motto he had as he traveled, And he was thinking of discrimination, and he was a leader in civil rights and gay rights and so forth, way before a lot of other people. And he would say, we would go a lot faster, this is appropriate for Lowell, right? We'd go a lot faster all rowing together and not leaving a couple of people out of the boat. So, I think that's true, and it's a good lesson.
Yeah, absolutely love that. Thank you again.
Okay,